Thank you so much for tuning in with us. We're delighted to have you here for our celebration of International Women's Day. We have a really interesting and fun panel today to talk about a remarkable woman. Lindy Boggs was a trailbreaker in so many ways. She came into Congress in an often traditional way with her husband as a spouse and then as a member of Congress. She came in that way as a result of a terrible tragedy where her husband was lost in Alaska when he was on congressional business. Mrs. Boggs served as a role model when there weren't very many women in Congress, and she showed everyone how to be a leader. And if you talk to her, she will also say, and how to be a lady. Very much a Louisiana leader. Today, to talk about this, we have a very distinguished panel. We're going to open with Farah Elliott. Now, why, you might say, Farah Elliott, who is the curator of the House of Representatives and the chief of the Office of Art and Archives, why would she be here? She's here because she's responsible for documenting, preserving, and presenting the art, artifacts, and records of the House of Representatives. And under her leadership, with the encouragement, support, and authorization of the House of Representatives, the very first room in the Capitol named for a woman was named for Lindy Boggs. Farah Elliott's academic background is in art history, beginning at Bryn Mawr College and continuing at George Washington University. Her work has taken her to the Smithsonian Institution, the Richmond History Center in Richmond, Virginia, the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum in Vermont, and she's been at the House of Representatives since 2002. And in addition to her responsibilities in the House, she was deeply involved in the development of the Capitol Visitor Center and in all of the local and national museum and art communities. She is indeed a leader in her field. Following Miss Elliott's presentation, we are going to hear from a gentleman who has been an incredible supporter of the Capitol Historical Society. Jan Schoonmaker is a Capitol Hill resident, but more importantly for today, for 16 years, he was a staff member for Lindy Boggs in increasing levels of responsibility to provide leadership in that office. He knows more about the Boggs family, about Mrs. Boggs's legislative priorities, about Louisiana politics, about the challenges of being a woman in politics than almost anybody else you would know. Following his time there, he went to Van Scoik Associates and continues to be an active board member with us at the Capitol Historical Society. So we're going to listen to Jan talk about behind the scenes working for Lindy Boggs. And then we conclude with Ambassador Connie Morella. Ambassador Morella served with Mrs. Boggs. Ambassador Morella has been a guest with us before and is just so inspiring. She's the child of immigrants, and she too helped break barriers in a career that saw her serve as the United States Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So if you think about Mrs. Morella and Mrs. Boggs, both served in Congress, both became ambassadors, both were trailbreakers. Mrs. Morella is simply a Republican, Mrs. Boggs a Democrat, but they were friends across the aisle. And on Capitol Hill, Connie Morella prided herself on supporting policies that were popular with her constituents, not her party, and fought the growing polarization she saw developing. She co-chaired the House Women's Caucus, chaired the House Subcommittee on Technology, And for her work in Congress and as an ambassador, Morella has received awards of merit in the United States, Italy, Germany, and Japan. Following our three speakers, we will do our traditional questions and answers. Put your questions in the Q&A and I will send them around and pose them to our different folks. If you want to have them posed to a particular person, do indicate that and we will take it from there. So to get us started, why do we have a room named for Mrs. Boggs? Farah Elliott, tell us a story.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thanks for having me here. It's really quite wonderful. And the Boggs Room and Mrs. Boggs, of course, are near and dear to the hearts of anyone who is an institutionalist on the Hill and anyone who loves history, whether they know they owe so much to Mrs. Boggs or not, they certainly do. I thought I would get all of us up to speed from the beginning of time up to Mrs. Boggs' service by taking us through the earlier history of H235, what would eventually become the Boggs Room. So this will be a quick romp through history. And so I will share my screen so I can get us started on experiencing the Boggs Room. This is what it looks like today. This is just one room in a suite of rooms that are called H235, but this is the room we think of most as the Boggs Room, and it's the largest and the most impressive. It started its life out much earlier than this, when it was the Speaker's office for Henry Clay, when the House moved back into the Capitol after it was reconstructed following the British burning it in 1814 during the War of 1812. And the entire chamber was completely reconstructed. Before, it had been more of a lozenge shape, a little more like the House of Commons, where people faced each other, but it was reconstructed into more of a semicircle. This is a very early plan, and it actually is a little disconcerting to us because this was the one session of Congress where they turned everybody around and had them face the other direction because they couldn't figure out how to hear each other. But the reason I pulled this up for you all to see it is that you can see where the Boggs Room is when it becomes a Speaker's office. If you look in the lower left, right down here, this little words you can't see say door to Speaker's Room. So behind the columns, there were these big empty spaces that were essentially lobbies, but here you would go directly to the Speaker's Room. And that was important because in an era before iPhones, Blackberries, pagers, even the bell system, in order to keep an eye on what was going on the floor of the House, you needed to be right nearby, which turned out to be a very handy thing for Speaker Clay and the speakers that followed him up until 1857, when the new House chamber was built and the Speaker moved to a dandy little space that was close to that chamber. But while this was the Speaker's office from 1819 to 1857, it saw some action and not just the usual wheeling and dealing stuff. In 1848, John Quincy Adams, former president, the only former president to serve in the House, was in the House chamber. It was a February morning, cold and beautiful. He was known as Old Man Eloquent because in his latter years in the House, he had become not only a parliamentary whiz that he had always been, having been in public service from the age of 16, but also an abolitionist and a supporter of the abolitionist cause, both in his district in Massachusetts and more broadly, and was brilliant at drawing the fire of Southern slaveholders. It was like he would just lay it down and they couldn't help picking it up. They could not help it. So he would tie them in knots with his eloquence. And Even as a very, very old man in 1848, he was continuing to do that. And one morning in February, he stood up to vote against something and was felled by a fit of apoplexy, or as we would call it, a stroke. And he was caught in the strong arms of younger members who were standing right next to him. And around the rim of the chamber were a bunch of very sturdy sofas for people to sit on. In fact, they were almost a little like prison riot furniture. They were supposed to really last because things took a beating in the House chamber. Everybody's spitting tobacco, everybody's armed, everybody's just running around. So they put him on one of these sofas and eventually they carried him around on the sofa for a little while, and eventually then took him from the chamber out on the east steps, which you can see here, and then took him into what was the Speaker's offices, what we now know as the Boggs Room. And he lingered there for a couple of days, apparently all cocooned up, according to this, and then eventually died on that prison riot furniture sofa that had come from the chamber. He never left it. And that sofa still exists. It is in the House collection, and it is in the Boggs Room. It has been part of the Boggs Room furniture. It began its Boggs Room experience in 1848, and it is still there today. It is a beloved piece of furniture. I can't say it's hugely comfortable, but it is a much revered piece of furniture. And in fact, it is not just the sofa of doom for John Quincy Adams. In 1899, 50 years later, the Attorney General died on it. He was in a meeting on the air and also died on it. So it's a dangerous sofa, let's say. But it is quite wonderful. We had it conserved a few years ago and were able to discover that it was probably made in the Capitol, and it was originally upholstered in black horsehair, which was what you put on stuff when you really wanted it to last a long time. It's kind of like oilcloth or I don't know, naugahyde or something, in that it was just a hard-wearing fabric, but it also snags clothing a lot. So we chose not to reupholster it in that exact same fabric. Also, it's a little depressing looking. It is upholstered now in a fabric that is appropriate to the period. It's a reproduction of an 1820s, 1830s fabric. Now, I am going to move us along to what happens after John Quincy Adams dies. So you can see another artifact that is in the Boggs Room. There's the sofa, and there is also a bust of John Quincy Adams made in 1845 and purchased in 1849 by the House of Representatives to put into the Boggs Room. And right below it is also a marble plaque that notes that John Quincy Adams was stricken in the House chamber and carried thence, where he died, in this very room. This is by John Cruikshank's King, and there are several versions of it, but this is the original one that was purchased by the House. Now, after that, the Boggs Room spends a little more time being a room that is used for very specific legislative purposes. It's the office of the clerk for a while. It's the Committee on Banking and Currency uses it for a long time. The enrolling clerk uses it. There was even a trap door in the ceiling so they could get up into where they were storing papers up in the crawl space, which sounds like a very bad idea to me. And during all of that time, Congress is changing. It's 1857 is a very long time ago. After that time, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments happen, and the first African Americans and first Hispanic American representatives come into the House. And of course, in the early 20th century, women come into suffrage and into Congress. And in 1927, the number of women in Congress had grown to 3. It was so many that the Speaker Longworth, assigned them a room for themselves because it was still considered somewhat distasteful for a lady to be out wandering around in public and certainly not using a public bathroom. So nowhere near the chamber, a different floor, down a corridor, down another corridor, there was a room that Joe Cannon had been using as a hideaway, and he had left Congress, and it was given to those 3 women to use. Essentially, it was just a room, and they sort of like put a little box-shaped space they'd carved off of it that became a bathroom. So that's 1927 and the 3 women in Congress. By the 1950s, the number of women in Congress had quintupled. The bathroom had not. So you can imagine the lines were long, the room was crowded, and it was very far away from the chamber, very far away from the beautifully appointed men's room right off the chamber, with its big gold mirror and shoe shine stand. So in the 1950s, rather than the 3 women who were originally there, Florence Kahn, who you see here, Mary Norton, the first Democratic woman in Congress, and Edith Noyes Rogers, who for a very long time was the longest serving woman in Congress, but recently was jumped. The line was jumped, and now that honor is given to Marcy Kaptur, the longest serving woman in the House. So these women all were there an extremely long time. And in fact, Edith Noyes Rogers was still serving in Congress in the late 1950s when Edith Green began agitating with her fellow women members for a bigger and better and closer bathroom. So in 1958, she began to do that, and it was another 4 years before the Speaker gave the women of Congress a room of their own. And at that time, when they did take over what is now the Boggs Room, they brought with them this mirror, and that mirror is still in the Boggs Room. They said that it suited their purpose. They had great sentimental value to them, and they weren't leaving without it. So there. So it came upstairs with them and is probably the only thing in the room that has stayed with the women's retiring room since the 1920s. Other stuff, like the John Quincy Adams sofa on the right there, was in the room already. And there you can see that giant mirror in the background there. So it's 1962. The women get this room and some adjoining spaces, and it's called the Congresswomen's Retiring Room from 1962 until a little bit later. So it is used by Lindy Boggs for a long time, used by all the women of Congress. They could all fit in there quite easily for a number of years, but that is no longer the case. And the influx of women who came, especially in the 1970s and 80s, riding on the second wave of feminism and the Watergate reforms, really increased the number a great deal. And one of the revered women who was older than that generation, but served at the same time that generation, was Lindy Boggs. And her stalwart staffer and my friend of 20 years, Jan Schoonmaker, can take over this story from there.
Let me unmute and thank you, Farah. I hope everybody realizes Farah is a great resource on art and history for the House of Representatives. She's a font of information. It's very appropriate that we're having this discussion today on International Women's Day. Lindy's birthday is later this week on March 13th. She would have been 106 years old. Lindy was born at Brunswick Plantation in Pointe Coupee Parish of Louisiana in 1916. She was elected to the House in March 1973 to replace her husband, Hale Boggs, who had been majority leader and had been lost in an airplane crash. She retired from the House in 1990 after serving 9 terms, the 93rd Congress to the 101st Congress. In 1997, she was appointed by President Bill Clinton to be ambassador to the Vatican, serving in that position through the year 2000. She died July 25th, 2013, at the ripe old age of 97, following a rewarding life and career. When Lindy was first elected to Congress in 1973, there were only 16 women in the House of Representatives and none in the Senate. When she retired in 1990, there were 29 women in the House and 2 in the Senate. Today, in the 117th Congress, there are 125 women serving in the House and 24 in the Senate. While this is steady progress, it's still not 50%. Lindy served with some spectacular women. When she was first elected in 1973, some of her star legislative colleagues included Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm, Millicent Fenwick and Helen Meyer, Peggy Heckler, Margie Holt, and Gladys Noon Spellman, Barbara Jordan, Martha Keyes, Patsy Mink, Pat Schroeder, and Lenore Sullivan were among the significant members who really guided legislation in the 70s and 80s, important legislation. Over the next 18 years, distinguished women leaders took their place in the House, including Barbara Mikulski, Barbara Boxer, Nancy Pelosi, Barbara Kennelly, Louise Slaughter, Nina Lowey, and Marcy Kaptur. These women would frequently gather in room H235, the Congresswoman's reading room of the retiring room, which is off the second floor east front corridor of the Capitol. The room became their own private hideaway, a rare House perk that normally requires many years of service before you can obtain a hideaway. There they would meet with each other, with constituents, with staff. They planned their legislative strategy or just relaxed to get away from their male colleagues. Lindy used the suite as much or more than any other member. She liked to do her phone calls from there, sign her mail, or just catch her breath. When her staff was looking for her, the first place we'd look is at H235. I want to mention the person that was responsible for the room during Lindy's service in the House, a woman named Helen Roper. She was always very helpful to Lindy and the other women and would call us when mail was signed or when Lindy forgot her purse, and I would have to go over and pick it up. I remember once attending a meeting in H235 when Representative Phil Burton came in because the door to the corridor had been left open. He didn't know the ladies had such a nice hideaway. Lindy said, hands off, and told him they'd give up the room when the ladies made up 50% of the House. Interestingly, his successor, Sally Burton, and her successor, Nancy Pelosi, both utilized the suite. In October 1990, following Lindy's announcement that she was going to retire at the end of the 101st Congress, 157 of her colleagues joined to sponsor House Resolution 525 to rename H235 as the Lindy Claiborne Boggs Women's Reading Room. It was the first room in the Capitol to be named after a woman. The then officers of the House, Don Anderson, the clerk, Jack Russ, the sergeant at arms, and Jimmy Malloy, the doorkeeper, and Bob Rhoda, the postmaster, got together and commissioned a large format photographic portrait of Lindy by a noted New York photographer, which was unveiled as part of the dedication of the room in Lindy's honor. This very striking portrait hung in the room for several years, but in 2002, I was approached by a friend, Jeff Trandle, then the clerk of the House. He explained the fine arts collection of the House included works of art, but not photographs of members, even professional photographs as fine as the one in the Boggs Room. He suggested a painted portrait would be treated differently. After much discussion among friends, former staffers of Lindy's, Tony Gelderman of New Orleans, who had been a page for Lindy, and I decided we would raise the funds necessary for a real portrait. Farah Elliott, house curator, kindly took me under her wing and explained to me the congressional portrait process and provided me with albums of various portrait studios. I didn't realize at the time the number and range of the companies that represented portrait artists who specialized in corporate, academic, and government portraits. Farah also put me in touch with Paul McGuire at the House Historical Society, who explained to me how the society could function as the bank to hold the funds raised for the portrait. It's a very effective and transparent system that still exists today. Tony and I looked at several artists. We consulted with Farah on types of and styles that would be appropriate for the Capitol building. Of course, we needed to talk to Lindy to get her go-ahead. On February 1st, 2003, Lindy was in DC for the annual Washington Mardi Gras festivities at the Washington Hilton. I arranged to have lunch with her at the hotel to go over various artists that Farah was advising were appropriate for the Capitol. Lindy went through the portfolios, but expressed concern that she didn't look like she did when she first arrived in Congress 30 years previously. I told her that was the magic the artist brings to the portrait process. After lunch, we were shocked to learn of the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. Lindy had always been a major supporter of NASA, and the Columbia accident, along with the Challenger accident, had really affected her emotionally. A happy day had turned into a very sad one. Lindy selected a young artist, Ned Bittinger, who was from Washington, ironically had grown up near the Boggs family residence on Bradley Boulevard in Bethesda. Ned said he had rode past Lindy's house on the way to the Landon School for many years. I think that helps establish a good personal relationship between the two of them. Ned spent some time in New Orleans with Lindy sitting for him. Dolly Seelmeyer, one of the official photographers of the House of Representatives, provided a raft of photographs that she and colleagues had taken of Lindy over the years, so that Ned could see Lindy in various settings during her long career. Lindy sat for Lindy in the dining room of her home at 623 Bourbon Street. If you'd show the next photograph, Sam. The house had been built in 1797 by the Spanish notary. Lindy inherited the house in about 1975 from an aunt, Frosty Morrison Blackshear. Following extensive renovations, it was a lovely showplace that was used for many charitable events and similar activities. As a matter of fact, she hosted a wonderful party in the home for her Republican congressional colleagues during the 1988 Republican National Convention in New Orleans. All attendees agreed that it was the biggest hit of the whole week. As you may note, the dining room in the portrait is painted a rich red because Lindy said Thomas Jefferson believed the color red aided to the digestion of fine food. In the background, you can spy the edge of a portrait of her late husband, Hale Boggs, and to her immediate right is a reproduction of the statue of the Muse Clio in the Car of History. The original 1819 statue by the sculptor Carlo Florenzi is located a few feet from the Boggs Room in Statuary Hall. Lindy wanted something in the portrait that physically connected it to the Capitol building. Of course, Lindy frequently channeled the Muse Clio during the bicentennial and was a strong advocate of the House Historian's Office, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, the National Gallery. She understood the importance of history. It's also a privilege to note because New Orleans has a group of streets in the Lower Garden District that are named after the 9 classical muses, including Clio. The finished portrait was unveiled in New Orleans, September 18, 2004, in the Garden District home of Tony and Catherine Gelderman, with many friends and supporters present. We officially presented to the House of Representatives September 27th in the Raven Room of the Capitol, with many of her colleagues and family present. Subsequent to painting Lindy's portrait, the artist Ned Bittinger painted the Abraham Lincoln portrait for the Capitol and the portrait of former Representative John Mica for the Transportation and Infrastructure Room in the Rayburn Building. Just I wanted to note that Lindy was a great supporter of the Capitol Historical Society. She received the 2001 Freedom Award from the Society, as well as the 2006 Distinguished Service Award from the House of Representatives. I will now yield the floor to Connie Morello, a good friend of Lindy's and a very dear friend of Lindy's daughter, Cokie Roberts.
Yes, great. I want to first of all thank the Congressional Historical, our National Historical Society, for putting this on. I think it's very appropriate. This is our way of celebrating both our National Women's Day, International Women's Day, and our Women's History Month too. I also want to thank Farah and Jan, of course, Jane and Sam, for putting this program together. I'm delighted to be on it. I'm just going to give you some anecdotes. First of all, Mrs. Lindy Claiborne Boggs was a neighbor of mine on Bradley Boulevard, a home where Cokie and Steve Roberts continued to live. And I miss Cokie, and I certainly miss Lindy too. And so I had heard about, in 1974, I was on a commission for women in Montgomery County, and we were looking at inequities and how they pertain to education and employment opportunities. And in 1974, that's exactly when the Equal Credit Act was passed in Congress, and Lindy Boggs had a great deal to do with it. And she, in her Louisiana brawl and charm, had said on the committee, well, I think you probably would like to include sex and marital status in the bill. And then she turned to the assistants and for them, nodded to them to put it in. And that's when the Equal Credit Act was passed and became law. That's the time when, if I had a credit card, I had to have a mail signed for me. And so think about what opportunities were kept from women in terms of buying a house, having a job, having some independence in their family, because they could not get the independence they needed with regard to equal credit. So I always admired Lindy Boggs. And then when I was in Congress, it was after Lindy she was in Congress and I was there. And in 1991, that was when we had the dedication of the Lindy Boggs Room. Prior to that time, it became the Congresswoman's reading room. It's a suite of art, not just the room that we saw, but it's a whole suite. And as a matter of fact, it even has a bedroom, a very nice bathroom with various amenities, but a bedroom. And there were times when Congress was meeting around the clock on legislation, and I would slip in, sometimes another colleague would, and sleep on that bed for a few hours, and then go back into the congressional arena. And that was another benefit of it too. I want to also indicate that it became a place where we could enhance our sisterhood. We could talk to the women members of Congress who were Democrats and Republicans, and we could share ideas. We could talk about family. We could talk about opportunities. As a matter of fact, when we very often would exit that room, we would see some of the male members kind of looking at us like, and so what are they conspiring to do? What have they already decided they're going to try? And it became a wonderful place, I must say. It was also a place that provided sort of the genesis or development of some major legislation that I care very much about. One was the Office of Equal Opportunity for Women at NIH, the Women's Health Office. We were able to, in a bipartisan way, it was Olympia Snow and Barbara Mikulski and Pat Schroeder and myself who met at NIH with then acting director Bill Robb. And it was then eventually put into the revitalization of NIH Act. And prior to that, women were not included in clinical trials or protocols. They were kind of looked at like little women. or little men, I should say, ignoring the fact that there were differences in terms of the sex and health that developed and spread into our other federal agencies too. Violence Against Women Act is another example where ideas could be shared. But this Lindy Boggs, what a remarkable woman. Everybody loved her. She had her way of getting her point across, and she was always open-minded and very receptive to other people. She listened, she learned, and she knew how to lead. When we had the dedication, that was in 1991, and she was there, and the portrait, beautiful portrait, was there. And she looked at the bust of John Quincy Adams, and she said, "Well, John," she said, your father did not listen to your mother Abigail when Abigail said, 'Remember the ladies,' and this is when he was drawing up the Declaration of Independence, and he didn't. But now, I think that she would feel a little encouragement and support, knowing that you are here, surrounded by strong women. And I always thought that that was what Lindy Boggs stood for. Strong women which help to create a strong nation. So she is dearly loved, and I'm so glad that you're doing something to a tip of the hat to a wonderful woman, a wonderful legend, and a place that indicates togetherness, bipartisanship, and harmony. Thank you.
Well, what a great set of stories. So now we're going to have a conversation. So Farah, come back and join us. We have a couple folks wanted, added in the time in which Lindy Boggs served. It was an everyday experience, and Ambassador, you were there, to be the only woman in the room. And so how do you think that is changed now that there are more women in Congress? And do we see the women banding together in the same way? Ambassador, why don't you start?
Oh, sure. I think there's just no doubt that it's made a big difference. And again, as has been said by Jan and Farah, we still need to go further. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's good. It's good that this is happening. I'm finding that the women, we still haven't the Office of Women's Research. In fact, I've been a board member for many years, and they look at legislation. They try to bring both parties together on issues. There have been some extremists in Congress, both female and male, and that has made it a little difficult, a little touchy about what they can discuss and who wants to come into the fold. But there is that sense of bipartisanship. It does happen. The Women's Policy Network, Women's Congressional Policy Institute, to be exact with the letters, now will meet. They have a special office, not at the Capitol, but they will meet, and they sometimes do meet at the Capitol, and they have wonderful programs they put on. They always do the programs in a bipartisan way, and it has allowed also the public to become involved with the issues that affect women, and male legislators have become involved and have looked for support. So a brief answer is yes, we've made some major steps forward with regard to the number of women representing all areas. But secondly, I still am concerned, Jane, about the polarization that has affected almost every entity in terms of productivity in Congress. Jan, you seem to be nodding affirmatively. You want to add to that?
The polarization is something that really concerns me, but I'll tell a little story about Lindy. When she wasn't the only woman in the room. Virginia Smith was also on the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee. But Lindy started asking a series of questions. As you all know, the Appropriations Committee has a very broad responsibility, But one of the important things they do every year is they get the cabinet secretaries or the agency directors come before the committee to explain the budget for the coming year. And all of a sudden, Lindy started asking questions. Well, how many women do you have in senior ranks at such and such an agency? Tell us about your programs to train women from the middle ranks of the agency, the middle GS schedules, to be senior executive service scheduled managers. And over the years, she would send these questions to other subcommittees. And over the years, I started to notice that there would be more women sitting at the table with the cabinet secretaries because they wanted to show that they were doing something positive to promote women to higher responsibilities at the agencies. Today, I think about half the cabinet, close to half the cabinet, is female. I may be wrong. I didn't do a head count, but I think we've seen a lot of progress. I don't know that Lindy was necessarily responsible for it, but I think she contributed to changing the face of American government to be more representative of the government.
Well, Jan, I can tell you from my own experience serving as a legislator in Ohio that having women at the table makes a difference. I'll tell you one small story from those days. I was on the finance committee and we were coming into the year 2000 and getting ready for the year 2000. The Secretary of Education was talking about how important it was that we train our students to deal with STEM. And he started in his whole discussion about this. And I turned to, at that point, there were 33 of us on the committee, 3 women. I turned to one of my colleagues and I said, are you going to ask or should I? And I said, look, I've been doing this. It's your turn. So she asked, and she raises her hand and gets called upon and says, Mr. Secretary, what are you going to do to ensure that the girls learn math and science? You should have seen the guy. He grinned ear to ear. And he said, well, I knew either you or Campbell were going to ask that question. And let me tell you that we have 9 scholars and 4 of them are women and three of them are African-American. And he had designed the whole program to be inclusive because he knew he was going to have to face us at the finance table. I turned to her and I said, it's a good thing we asked. Can you imagine how embarrassed it would if he'd done that and he hadn't gotten to give that speech? So what Mrs. Boggs did, Ambassador Morella, is totally, I'm sure, true in terms of changing the behavior. Now, we have a question from our audience, Farah, that you might be able to answer because you're, in and out of the chamber now. Now we have a woman vice president, and there's a vice president's suite. But the vice president's suite is over on the Senate side of the Capitol. When Vice President Harris is there, does she use the Lindy Boggs room?
That is an excellent question, and I have no idea what the answer is. I do know that historically, the Women's Caucus has invited the women Supreme Court justices and the women senators over to use the space, sometimes just for an event, but sometimes just, stop by. Ambassador Morella probably is more familiar with the corralling of women at the heights of government there. But I assume as the president of the Senate, she would be invited over to use it in the same way that any woman senator would.
Do you know, Ambassador, did any of the women senators ever come over to the Lindy Boggs room?
Yes, not as often as we would like, but they were always at our beck and call if we had issues that we wanted to make sure we had the Senate counterparts. And they formed their own little group. They would have, I think, dinner once a week or something like that. For us, we had the Lindy Claiborne Boggs Room, which was a nice convenient place because it was right at the Capitol. And as I said, we had all the amenities. We had a refrigerator. We always had cold drinks and maybe some others periodically, and not really. And had a nice opportunity to right off the floor of the House to go into the room. But no, the senators occasionally, but for something only very special. Yeah.
And we have sort of a participant who's joining us, giving us a little bit of additional history, Barbara Wolanin, who 30 years served the Capitol. And she reports that Lindy Boggs was her very favorite congressperson in all 30 years. And she cared so much about the art and history that she was the only member that accepted the architect of the Capitol's invitation to ride up on the elevator on the scaffold to see Bermudi's just restored apotheosis of Washington. So
I will say
Farrah,
this,
go ahead.
that Barbara Wolanin was Lindy's back channel source of communication for what needed to be done in the art world in the Capitol. Lindy frequently would talk to Barbara and say, what's not in the budget? What do we need in the architect's budget? And as we approached the bicentennial, there were some things that could have been in the budget but weren't, as far as restoring the canopy in the rotunda. And Lindy made sure Vic Fazio, who was the chairman of the Legislative Branch Subcommittee, put that funding in there. There was also an issue, there's a room H140 that belongs to the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. It's probably the most beautiful room in the House wing of the Capitol. That's where where Constantine Bermudi first painted his frescoes, because Montgomery Meigs was in charge of the building the wings for the House and Senate. And there had been a fire in that room many decades ago. The room needed some restoration, and the staff of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee weren't cooperating with the architect to move out of the room to restore the frescoes. And Lindy talked to the chairman of the subcommittee and said it was very important to the Capitol that this work be done. And now it's a very beautiful meeting room in the Capitol. But Barbara was always there to answer our questions or to encourage us to do the right thing.
And Farrah, you know, you're still working with the art and architecture of the Capitol and the precious treasures. You were there for the discussion about the naming of the room. Was there any reference to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report that identified the United States as sort of 30th in the world in terms of involvement of women? Was there any of that kind of conversation, or was it really just about Mrs. Boggs as such a unique individual?
Well, you're giving me more credit than I deserve. I actually was not around in the Capitol that early.
Okay.
So I could not tell you if that's the case. Possibly one of my fellow panelists could, but I'd certainly, if they can't, I'd certainly be happy to look into it and see if there's anything to be teased out.
Jan, do you
Back
know?
in the 80s, when Lindy was serving, there was a International Parliamentary Union special meeting on women parliamentarians. And Lindy was supposed to chair the group and unfortunately wasn't able to go because of a health issue, but she was bound and determined to get some women to go to that conference because she said it's embarrassing that the United States has so few women legislators compared to the Scandinavian countries and some Latin American countries that have prominent women in their delegations. And I recall we got Mary Rose Okar from Ohio was able to go, and I think one or two other members went. But Lindy felt it was very important for our female legislators to be among female legislators from other parliamentary bodies around the world.
Well, Ambassador, you did work around the world, and you started your career with the Montgomery County Commission on Women. Was early on in your day. So
in fact, it was the women's movement that put the movement into me. And that's how I got started. And that's how I thought, if you don't have what do they say? If you don't have a seat at the table, you might be on the menu. But then Shirley Chisholm, she upped that. She said, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And so, yes, I can see obviously that women have made a difference. I was able to represent our country at the Beijing Conference on Women. I was able to represent our country at the environmental conference in Brazil. I was able to represent our country in Egypt on development. And in all of these areas, women were a high point because you have to, if you're talking about development, you have to include women. If you're talking about, well, women's rights, of course, you need to have women, and in all those areas. So it was always very fruitful to connect with other women who would look to the United States for leadership in most areas, but then could show us leadership in their countries that we needed to try to emulate, you know, or customize. And so I think that linkage with the sisterhood throughout the world was critically important in bringing about some significant changes. Even now, there are a number of countries that are looked to our Violence Against Women Act in terms of finding parts of it that they need to legislate and then to enforce. So we can all learn from each other. But really right now, I just pray for what's happening in the world in terms of Ukraine, in terms of Russia, in terms of Afghanistan, speaking of women. And so I think it's most important that we all learn and help each other.
Well, Ambassador, you sort of bring us to a wonderful close, that we look at our government is better when it is inclusive. It's better when we have women. It's better when we have bipartisan activity, when people are getting along. You look at some of the things that went on in the early 70s. We're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Title IX, signed by President Nixon in June. You don't think, you know, and it, as we come to these milestone moments, we try to dedicate ourselves again to standing as a beacon of freedom, standing on behalf of the inclusion of everyone. So your participation, Farah, you have every single time we need to know something about what's going on with all the art, the architecture, the work you do with our portrait program. We are so fortunate to have you. And Jan is a fount of knowledge. I'm telling you, there's not a person who has worked at the Capitol that doesn't have a story about Jan Schoonmaker. You know, he's sort of, you think he's kind of a quiet guy, but oh my goodness, he knows everybody. And I will tell you the other thing that you may not know about Jan Schoonmaker is that he is a very good dancer. He and I ended up at a colleague's wedding, and we found ourselves on the dance floor and had an incredible time. It was not something I knew about him. So stay tuned. There are opportunities abound that you could learn about people. So we thank you for being with us. We thank you for spending your time with us. Sam, as always, we thank you for your work to make this possible. The scheduling, the behind the scenes, to get everybody in the right place at the right time. It looks easy. It's not. It's an incredible amount of work. Our next event that we have scheduled coming up is something which is a relatively new feature we call Capital Kids, which is where we bring authors who have written books that are set in the Capitol or set in Washington that give students an opportunity to learn about government. And our next Capitol Kids, and the authors then talk to classrooms. Now, of course, everybody's invited, but we specially focus on the classroom, you know, the classrooms coming and joining. And this one is special here because the book is written by Lindy Boggs' granddaughter, Rebecca Roberts. The suffrage playbook, here we have the visual. Let's see if we can get it properly in focus. If I put it where my face is, that might work. This is a great little book that is written for sort of middle school kids to talk about they call it Your Guide to Changing the World. And it was written by Rebecca Roberts and Lucinda Robb, both women who grew up in strong political families. And so we look at Lindy Boggs's contribution. We talked about her own contributions, but one of her major contributions was Cokie Roberts, who was a longtime board member of ours, a distinguished journalist. And Cokie Roberts gave us Rebecca Roberts, who is a historian and still doing work. So the legacy continues. I hope that if you know anybody that is an educator, that is interested in participating, or if you just would like to hear a great story about a fun book, please join us on Tuesday, March 29th at 2. For students that are participating, you know, if the teachers let us know, then the teachers can send in questions from all the students, and we do the same Q&A. We just did it with the Fina Mendoza mystery about the State of the Union and had a great time. So we hope that you will share this opportunity as we move forward. As always, I always have to have my little moment, which is, we call it the NPR moment. The United States Capitol Historical Society is funded by donors, private donors, individual members. We're not funded by the government. You saw the Clio clock in the picture, and that replica is sold by the United States Capitol Historical Society. So you can buy our commemorative merchandise as a way to support the society. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your engagement. Thank you very much. We look forward to working with you. Connie, Jan, Farah, thank you. God bless.